A cheap, worn leather diary. A stack of candid surveillance photographs showing an innocent family hundreds of miles away. And a man, a feared mafia boss whose mere name commanded empires of violence, frozen in the center of his lavish master bedroom. Standing just over his shoulder, watching her carefully constructed world collapse in real time, was his own wife, both hands clamped over her mouth in sheer, unmistakable terror. What Rocco Barone discovered hidden beneath the floorboards of his missing maid's bedroom didn't just break his heart. It shattered his entire reality, his marriage, and the illusion of the woman he had trusted to protect his son. But here is the question that will haunt you throughout this entire story. Who was the real monster in that mansion? The maid who abandoned a terrified child in the dead of night? Or the untouchable wife who forced her out? Before we dive into this dark and incredible story, I need you to do something for me. If you believe that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way to the surface, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because uncovering intense, jaw-dropping stories like this one is exactly what we do here. And drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever trusted someone with the most precious part of your life, only to discover they were hiding a truly terrifying secret behind closed doors? I want to hear your thoughts. Now, let's get into it. Rocco Barone stepped out of his armored black SUV, the heavy thud of the door echoing through the sprawling courtyard of his fortified estate. He wore a sharply tailored navy suit, the collar of his crisp white shirt unbuttoned, projecting immense wealth and terrifying authority without a single ounce of effort. He had just returned from a grueling 3-day sit-down with a rival crime family in New York. The tension of the underworld had been suffocating, and all he wanted was to pour a glass of scotch, loosen his collar, and see his young son, Leo. But the moment Rocco's Italian leather shoes touched the marble flooring of his grand foyer, his survival instincts, honed by decades in the Mafia, flared to life. The mansion was entirely too quiet. There was no smell of dinner wafting from the kitchen, no sound of cartoons playing in the den. "Leo?" Rocco's deep, gravelly voice resonated up the sweeping double staircase. Silence. Suddenly, Petra, his wife of 3 years, appeared at the top of the landing. Her long, wavy blonde hair fell perfectly over a deep burgundy wrap dress. She glided down the stairs holding a crystal glass of bourbon, wearing a rehearsed, exasperated sigh. "Darling, you're home early," she purred smoothly, offering him the drink. "It's been an absolute nightmare today. Renata is gone." Rocco froze. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "She walked out," Petra said without missing a beat, taking a casual sip of her drink. "I scolded her for breaking a vase, and she had the audacity to demand a raise. When I said no, she packed her things and stormed out without a word." Rocco felt a sharp pang of sadness, immediately followed by a surge of deep, protective anger. Renata Holloway, the young, bright-smiling maid, had been Leo's shadow. She was the only one who could coax his quiet, anxious son out of his shell. How could she just abandon him over a petty dispute? Ignoring his wife's outstretched hand, Rocco bypassed the living room and marched straight upstairs to Leo's bedroom. He pushed the heavy oak door open. The room was pitch black. And there, curled into a tight, trembling ball underneath the bed, was his 4-year-old son. His eyes were wide with a pure, unadulterated terror that had absolutely nothing to do with a broken vase. Rocco knelt on the plush carpet, his massive frame awkwardly folding into the tight space beside the bed. "Leo," he murmured, keeping his deep voice as soft as the rumble of a distant engine. "It's Papa. I'm here." The 4-year-old didn't reach for him, Instead, Leo pressed his back harder against the wall, his small hands gripping his knees. The darkness of the bedroom felt oppressive, thick with an unspoken trauma that Rocco couldn't quite name. He reached out a large, scarred hand, hoping to stroke the boy's hair, but Leo scrambled backward, hitting his head against the baseboard in his desperation to retreat. His eyes, usually bright and observant, were glassy and locked onto the bedroom door. Downstairs, the sharp, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of Petra's designer heels echoed against the marble floor. With every single click, Leo's tiny shoulders flinched violently. He wasn't just upset. He was exhibiting the pure, instinctual responses of a cornered animal. Rocco had spent his entire life reading the subtle body language of dangerous men, men who lied for a living. The terror radiating from his son wasn't the result of a missing maid. It was the dread of the woman downstairs. The protective anger Rocco had felt toward Renata, the fury at her supposed abandonment, began to cool, instantly hardening into a cold, calculated suspicion. The narrative Petra had spun in the foyer was too neat, too rehearsed. She demanded a raise. She packed her things. She stormed out. It was a clean story, devoid of the messy reality of human emotion. Leaving Leo in the dark, Rocco stood up, his jaw set tightly. He didn't return to the foyer to confront his wife. Instead, he bypassed the sweeping staircase and walked silently down the narrow, dimly lit hallway that led to the staff quarters. He needed to see the physical evidence of this sudden departure. He pushed open the door to Renata's room, and the air immediately felt different. It was stale, heavy with an unspoken interruption. Rocco stepped inside, his dark eyes scanning the small space with the precision of a predator surveying a crime scene. Petra claimed Renata had packed her things, but the small, meticulously kept room told a wildly different story. On the edge of the narrow mattress sat a plastic laundry basket. Beside it lay 3 of Leo's favorite superhero t-shirts, perfectly folded, while a 4th lay crumpled, abandoned mid-crease. Rocco reached out, his thick fingers brushing the cotton fabric. He moved past the bed and pulled open the small closet door. Her heavy winter coat, the one she wore every single morning when waiting for Leo's school bus, was still hanging there, alongside her modest collection of everyday clothes. You do not demand a sudden payout and storm out of a heavily guarded Mafia estate in the middle of folding a child's laundry. It defied all logic. His gaze drifted to the cheap wooden nightstand. Resting beside a small, framed photograph of Renata's family was a faded wooden rosary. Rocco knew that rosary. It had belonged to Renata's grandmother, a woman she spoke of with immense, unwavering reverence. Renata never took it off her nightstand. She prayed with it every single night. A woman fleeing for a better paycheck takes her money and her valuables. A woman fleeing for her life leaves behind her very soul. The subtle signs were no longer just whispers of doubt. They were screaming a warning. Something violent had happened beneath his own roof. Rocco's boots struck the marble with heavy, measured precision as he bypassed the main living areas and descended into the subterranean level of the estate. The security hub was a climate-controlled bunker, humming with the low frequency of server racks and illuminated by the glow of dozens of monitors. His head of security, a scarred loyalist named Marco, stood at rigid attention the moment Rocco entered. Rocco didn't waste breath on pleasantries. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble as he ordered Marco to pull up the exterior and hallway footage from the past 24 hours. Marco's fingers flew across the keyboard, bringing up the time-stamped grids of the mansion's interior. But as the digital clock in the corner of the screen ticked past 2 in the morning, the screens suddenly cut to a wall of gray static. An entire 2-hour block of footage, the exact window when Renata supposedly packed her bags and stormed out in a rage, had been meticulously wiped. Marco's face drained of color as he scrambled to explain the anomaly, stammering about a potential system glitch or a corrupted hard drive, but Rocco raised a single commanding hand to silence him. In the Mafia, there were absolutely no coincidences. There were only breaches, betrayals, and deliberate cover-ups. The subtle, nagging signs of foul play had just erupted into glaring, undeniable alarms. Someone with high-level clearance inside his own house had orchestrated a blind spot. He turned on his heel, ascending the stairs with a dark, suffocating fury tightening his chest. Rocco marched straight back to the staff quarters, throwing the door to Renata's room open so hard the handle punched a dent into the drywall. If she had been forced out during that 2-hour blackout, she wouldn't have been able to take her secrets with her. He began to systematically tear the room apart. It wasn't the frantic, messy search of a panicked man, but the cold, methodical dismantling of a seasoned investigator looking for a hidden cache. He stripped the mattress, shattered the cheap bedside lamp to check its hollow base, and pulled the drawers from the dresser, dumping their meager contents onto the floor. Nothing. He ran his thick hands along the underside of the bed frame and checked the screws on the ventilation grates. Still nothing. He stood in the center of the wreckage, his chest heaving, his sharp, deep-set eyes scanning the bare architecture of the room. That was when he finally saw it. Near the iron radiator, hidden perfectly in the shadow of the baseboard, was a deep, fresh scuff mark on the hardwood. It was the frantic gouge of a fingernail or a hastily used tool. Rocco dropped to his knees. He wedged his heavy pocket knife into the seam of the floorboard and pulled upward with a violent wrench. The wood splintered and gave way with a sharp crack. Resting in the dusty cavity beneath the floor was a cheap, worn leather diary and a thick, heavy manila envelope. The heavy oak door of Rocco's private study clicked shut, sealing him inside a soundproof vault of mahogany and leather. He crossed the room, pouring 2 fingers of neat scotch into a crystal glass, but he didn't drink. His massive frame settled into the leather chair behind his desk, the silence of the room pressing heavily against his eardrums. He placed the worn diary and the thick envelope under the pool of warm light from his desk lamp. He opened the journal first, half expecting to find the mundane complaints of an overworked employee. Instead, he found a meticulously documented nightmare. The pages were filled with Renata's frantic, cramped handwriting, detailing the horrors that occurred the moment Rocco's armored SUV pulled out of the estate gates. Page after page described Petra's venomous, calculated cruelty. Dates and times aligned perfectly with his out-of-state business trips. There were lengthy entries about Petra locking Leo in the pitch-black coat closet for hours simply because the boy had cried for his father. Entries detailed Petra screaming insults at a 4-year-old, withholding his meals, and isolating him in his room while she hosted lavish, champagne-drenched parties downstairs. Intertwined with the abuse was the quiet, desperate heroism of the maid. Renata wrote about sneaking Leo plates of warm food in the dead of night, holding him until his violent trembling stopped, and purposefully absorbing Petra's verbal abuse to draw the woman's wrath away from the child. Rocco's hands shook, not with grief, but with a volcanic, murderous rage. He had built an empire of violence to protect his bloodline, only to invite a monster into his own home. He had been willfully blind, assuming his wealth was enough to shield his son. He shoved the diary aside and reached for the manila envelope, breaking the metal clasp. A stack of high-resolution surveillance photographs spilled across the polished mahogany. Rocco's breath hitched in his throat. They were pictures of a modest, working-class neighborhood. In the center of the frame was an older black couple carrying groceries and a young teenage boy walking out of a high school. It was Renata's family in her distant hometown. The photos were stamped with dates from earlier that week. Crosshairs were drawn in red ink over the teenager's face.
Rocco flipped to the final, hastily scribbled entry in the diary, dated just yesterday. It was a frantic, terrified goodbye. Petra had cornered Renata in the laundry room, slamming these very photos against the washing machine. She had delivered a terrifying ultimatum. Renata was to pack a single bag and vanish into the night without a trace, or Petra would make a single phone call and have a hit squad sent to her parents' doorstep by morning. Petra didn't just want the maid gone. She wanted the boy's only protector completely erased. She had utilized Mafia intimidation tactics against an innocent family, ensuring Leo would be left completely vulnerable, isolated,
and alone, under her absolute control. The glass of scotch shattered violently against the stone fireplace, but Rocco barely registered the sound. He stood up, his massive chest rising and falling with a slow, mechanical rhythm. The immediate burning anger had ripped completely through him, leaving behind nothing but a chilling, absolute emptiness. He gathered the worn diary and the glossy surveillance photographs in his left hand, his grip tight enough to bend the cardboard edges. He didn't rush. He didn't storm out of the study in a blind rage. Instead, he moved with the terrifying, deliberate grace of an executioner ascending the steps to the gallows. He walked up the sweeping grand staircase, the mansion silent and heavy around him, and pushed open the heavy double doors to the master suite. Petra was draped across the foot of the massive four-poster bed, wearing a silk robe that slipped strategically off one shoulder. The fragile, put-upon smile she had worn in the foyer had returned, carefully crafted to elicit sympathy from a husband she believed she had entirely outsmarted. "Rocco, darling," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she patted the empty mattress beside her. "Please tell me you aren't going to let that ungrateful girl ruin your first night back. I've been waiting for you." Rocco didn't say a single word. He didn't blink. He simply walked to the edge of the mattress and opened his hand. The worn leather diary and the stack of red-inked surveillance photographs hit the pristine silk sheets with a heavy, final slap. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating the massive room. Petra's gaze dropped to the objects. The moment her eyes registered the faded leather cover and the glossy faces of Renata's family, the color violently drained from her flawless skin. Her practiced, elegant smile didn't just fade, it completely shattered. Her knees gave out beneath the silk, and she scrambled backward against the tufted headboard, both hands flying up to clamp over her mouth in sheer, unmistakable terror. She was looking into the deep-set eyes of a man who commanded an army of killers. And she had just been caught, employing his own brutal tactics against his blood. "Rocco, I can explain," she stammered, her voice pitching into a shrill, desperate whine. She lunged forward, her trembling hands frantically trying to cover the photographs. "She was a thief! She was obsessed with Leo. I did it for us, for our privacy. She was trying to turn your own son against me." Rocco didn't yell. He didn't raise his hands to strike her. When he finally spoke, his voice was a deadly, quiet whisper that seemed to drop the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. "You threatened the blood of an innocent woman to isolate my son," he said, every syllable dripping with a lethal finality. "You used my name, and you used my world against a child." The terrifying calmness in his unreadable stare promised a consequence far worse than death. And in that freezing silence, Petra realized her carefully constructed reign had just violently ended. Petra's sobbing echoed against the vaulted ceiling of the master suite. A pathetic, wet sound that did absolutely nothing to soften the monolithic coldness radiating from her husband. Rocco extended a single, open palm, He didn't utter a word, but the demand was terrifyingly clear. Petra looked at his calloused hand, her trembling fingers instinctively clutching the massive, flawless diamond resting on her left ring finger. It was the physical manifestation of her power, her untouchable status as the wife of a boss. When she hesitated, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her mascara-stained cheeks, Rocco's deep-set eyes narrowed into dark, merciless slits. Slowly, painstakingly, she slid the platinum band over her knuckle, dropping it into his palm along with the matching diamond eternity band. Rocco didn't stop there. With a voice devoid of any human warmth, he ordered her to surrender her platinum credit cards, her estate keys, and the encrypted phone that connected her to his security detail. She was being systematically erased. Stripped of the Barone name and the immense, terrifying shield it provided, she was suddenly nothing more than a treacherous stranger standing in a room she no longer owned. "You have exactly 10 minutes to pack a single bag of your personal clothing," Rocco stated, his gravelly voice slicing through her desperate, gasping apologies. "You will leave all jewelry, all cash, and all electronics. My men will escort you to the front gates. You will walk out of this estate, and you will never, under any circumstances, attempt to return." Petra collapsed forward, trying to grab the lapels of his navy suit, begging him to consider their marriage, to consider her reputation in the city. Rocco didn't even flinch. He looked down at her with a chilling, detached emptiness. "If you ever speak my son's name again," he whispered, leaning in so close she could feel the icy promise of his breath. "If you ever even look in the direction of this house, or if I find out you breathed the word of my family's business to the rats you've been dining with, you will not just be banished. You will simply disappear permanently, and no one in this city will ever bother to look for you." The threat hung in the freezing air, absolute and undeniable. Rocco turned his back on her, walking toward the heavy oak doors. He gestured sharply to Marco, who had been standing silently in the hallway. Two massive guards stepped into the bedroom, their faces like carved granite, and hauled Petra off the floor. Rocco didn't stay to watch her pack. He walked out to the grand balcony overlooking the front courtyard, lighting a cigar as he stared out into the pitch-black night. 10 minutes later, the heavy iron gates of the estate groaned open. Rocco watched the silhouette of the woman he had married being unceremoniously shoved onto the dark, empty street, her designer luggage tossed out onto the pavement behind her. The gates slammed shut, locking her out of his empire forever. Without a second glance, Rocco pulled a burner phone from his breast pocket and dialed a number that wasn't in any directory. His most ruthless, trusted enforcer picked up on the first ring. The order Rocco gave was simple, devastating, and backed by the infinite resources of the Mafia. "Find the girl," he commanded softly, "and prepare a strike team." By sunrise, the sprawling Barone estate had transformed into a military command center. Rocco's men didn't just search for Renata. They executed a highly coordinated, multi-state manhunt funded by limitless illicit wealth. But the priority wasn't just locating the terrified Maid. It was neutralizing the leverage Petra had weaponized against her. Within hours, a convoy of unmarked black SUVs arrived in Renata's distant, working-class hometown. A heavily armed, invisible perimeter of Rocco's most lethal men was immediately established around her parents' modest brick house and her teenage brother's high school. They were ghosts in the neighborhood, watching from tinted windows and shadowed alleyways, under strict orders to brutally dismantle any rival hitmen who dared to step foot on that street. Renata's family went about their morning routines, completely unaware that they had just become the most heavily guarded civilians on the eastern seaboard. Rocco had secured her bloodline. Now, he just had to find her before the panic drove her into the hands of his enemies. While his empire scoured bus terminals, cheap motels, and train stations, The feared Mafia boss retreated to the only room in his mansion that truly mattered. Rocco pulled a heavy wooden chair to the side of Leo's small bed. The 4-year-old was finally asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling in an exhausted, fragile rhythm. The dark circles under the boy's eyes looked like bruises against his pale skin, a physical testament to the torment he had endured in silence. Rocco reached out, his thick, scarred hand gently resting over his son's small fingers. In his other hand, he held the worn leather diary. The morning light filtered through the heavy blackout curtains, illuminating the cramped, frantic handwriting that chronicled his ultimate failure as a father. He read the pages slowly, agonizing over every single word. He read about the nights Leo had cried until he threw up, terrified of the dark closet Petra had locked him inside. He read about Renata pressing her back against the closet door, whispering lullabies through the wood, promising the little boy that he wasn't alone, that she was standing guard until his father came home. Rocco felt a crushing, suffocating weight pressing down on his lungs. It was the unbearable agony of his own willful blindness. He had built fortresses, amassed armies, and shed rivers of blood to ensure his son would never know the violence of his world, only to hand the boy over to a monster disguised in designer silk. The diary wasn't just a ledger of abuse. It was a manual on how to love his son. Renata had documented Leo's favorite nighttime stories, the specific way his crusts needed to be cut, and the exact tone of voice required to pull him out of a panic attack. She had been the mother Rocco's wealth could never buy, stepping into the line of fire to shield a child that wasn't hers. Rocco closed the leather cover, his throat tight, his vision blurring with a rare, stinging heat. He had spent his life demanding loyalty through fear. But the young woman currently running for her life had shown a profound, sacrificial loyalty that humbled him entirely. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the edge of Leo's mattress, making a silent, unbreakable oath. He would tear the world apart to bring Renata back. And when he found her, he wouldn't just offer her a job. He would offer her the absolute protection of his empire for the rest of her life. The flickering neon light of a rundown bus terminal 3 states away cast long, unnatural shadows across the cracked linoleum floor. Renata sat huddled in the corner of a cramped, windowless holding office, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. She had been running for 48 hours, jumping from cheap commuter trains to suffocating buses, driven by the absolute certainty that Petra Baron's hitmen were right behind her. Every sudden noise, a dropping suitcase, the hiss of air brakes, the heavy thud of boots on the pavement, sent a violent spike of adrenaline through her exhausted body. She had sacrificed everything, abandoning the little boy she loved as her own, just to keep her parents and teenage brother alive. Now, backed into a corner in a forgotten transit station, she heard the unmistakable sound of heavy, measured footsteps approaching the frosted glass of the office door. The brass handle turned slowly. Renata squeezed her eyes shut, her breathing shallow and ragged, bracing herself for the inevitable gunshot. But the gunfire never came. Instead, the door swung open, and the suffocating air of the tiny room was instantly displaced by an imposing, familiar presence. Renata slowly opened her eyes. Standing in the doorway was not a nameless, faceless assassin. It was Rocco Baron. The Mafia boss looked entirely out of place in the grimy terminal, his broad shoulders practically filling the doorframe, his tailored navy overcoat absorbing the dim light. For a terrifying second, Renata thought Petra had sent the boss himself to finish the job. But as Rocco stepped inside and gently closed the door behind him, he did something that defied everything she knew about the ruthless man. He reached up with a scarred, calloused hand and slowly removed his hat, holding it by his side in a gesture of profound, solemn respect. Rocco didn't demand answers. He didn't raise his voice. He reached into his overcoat, pulled out a sleek encrypted tablet, and placed it gently on the scarred wooden table between them. He tapped the screen, bringing up a crystal-clear live video feed. Renata gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. It was a feed of her parents' modest brick house. Her father was sitting on the porch, reading a newspaper, perfectly unharmed. Her teenage brother was shooting hoops in the driveway. And stationed discreetly at the end of the street, guarding the perimeter with lethal precision, were two unmarked black SUVs flanked by men in dark suits. "They are perfectly safe." Rocco's deep, gravelly voice broke the silence, vibrating with a quiet, unshakable promise. "They will be protected by my men for the rest of their lives. No one will ever touch them." Renata stared at the screen, the crushing, unbearable weight of the past 2 days finally fracturing. A ragged sob tore from her throat as the reality of her family's safety washed over her. But even in her overwhelming relief, her very next breath was dedicated to the child she had been forced to leave behind. She looked up at the terrifying mob boss, her dark eyes shining with unshed tears. "Leo," she whispered, her voice cracking. Is he okay?" Rocco's stoic expression broke, a flash of profound sorrow and deep reverence softening his hard, square jaw. He took a slow step forward, looking down at the young woman who had shielded his blood when he was too blind to see the threat. "He is safe," Rocco answered softly. "Because of you." Then, the man who commanded an underworld empire bowed his head slightly. "I am deeply, truly sorry. For my blindness. For what was done to you in my house. You protected my son when I failed him. I am here to bring you home." 6 months later, the sprawling Barone estate was fundamentally, irreversibly changed. The suffocating, museum-like coldness that had defined the mansion during Petra's reign had been completely eradicated. The heavy velvet blackout curtains had been pulled back, allowing bright, golden sunlight to flood the grand hallways. The air no longer smelled of sterile designer perfume and tension. It smelled of fresh coffee, blooming gardenias, and the unmistakable, vibrant energy of a home that was actually lived in. Petra was nothing more than a ghost of the past, a completely erased mistake whose name was never uttered within the iron gates of the property. The brutal Mafia boss had systematically dismantled the toxic environment he had once ignored, replacing it with an impenetrable fortress of warmth and absolute security. Rocco sat behind his massive mahogany desk in his private study, reviewing a ledger from his legitimate shipping businesses. Unlike the old days, where the heavy oak door was always firmly bolted shut to separate his violent world from his family, the doors were now propped wide open. He refused to compartmentalize his life anymore. He refused to be an absent shadow in his own son's world. As he signed a document, a sound drifted down the long, sunlit hallway that caused his pen to pause mid-stroke. It was a bright, unrestrained, bubbling laugh. It was Leo. The sound, which had once been entirely impossible within these walls, now echoed daily, a constant reminder of the horrific tragedy they had narrowly avoided. Rocco set his pen down, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. He pushed his chair back and walked quietly down the hallway, following the sound to the informal family den. He leaned his broad shoulder against the doorframe, crossing his arms as he took in the scene before him. Leo was sitting cross-legged on the thick, plush rug, his dark hair falling over his eyes as he giggled, trying to force a mismatched puzzle piece into place. Sitting right beside him, guiding his small hands with infinite, gentle patience, was Renata. She was no longer wearing the crisp, rigid maid's uniform of a subordinate. Instead, she wore a soft, elegant cashmere sweater and tailored trousers, looking every bit the refined, confident woman she had become. The anxiety and subservience that used to govern her every movement had vanished, replaced by a radiant, peaceful belonging. She wasn't an employee anymore. The monthly paychecks had stopped the day she returned, replaced by a massive trust fund, full access to the estate's resources, and a permanent, highly guarded detail assigned to her family back home. She was the untouchable heart of the Barone family. She had saved Leo's life, and in doing so, she had saved Rocco's soul. As Leo successfully snapped the final puzzle piece into place, he threw his arms around Renata's neck in a fierce, joyful hug. Renata hugged him back just as tightly, pressing a kiss to his temple before looking up. Her eyes met Rocco's across the room. There was no fear in her gaze, no hesitation, only a profound mutual respect and a deep, unspoken affection. Rocco nodded slowly, his heart steady and full. The Mafia boss had spent his entire life building an empire of power and fear, but standing there, watching his son laugh in the arms of the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, Rocco Barone finally knew what it meant to be truly wealthy.